Hey guys, tonight we slip into the desert silence, into a world where cliffs blush red under fading sunlight and stone facades glow as if they've been lit from within. You're standing before Petra, the rose-red city of the Nabataeans, a place that seems sculpted by gods but was in truth engineered by very determined humans with chisels, patience, and a bone-deep fear of dying of thirst. You probably won't survive this landscape, not unless you master water as ruthlessly as they did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a canyon so narrow you can stretch out your hands and nearly brush both sides. The Nabataeans called it the Sikh, and it's not just a dramatic front door, it's a funnel for flash floods. Every heavy rain in the mountains above sends torrents screaming down here. Yet the Nabataeans, instead of fleeing, bent this chaos to their will. Along one cliff wall you notice channels cut like veins, some sloping gently, some capped with stone. Rainwater once surged into these, diverted before it could drown the very visitors it lured. It's the kind of everyday genius that makes you wonder if any of us today could survive a single week in their sandals without Wi-Fi or sunscreen.
And, oh yes, sunscreen. The ancient Egyptians used crocodile dung in theirs, so if you thought modern SPF smelled bad, count your blessings.
The Nabataeans' story begins not in golden palaces but in dust and scarcity. Around the 4th century BCE, nomadic Arab tribes moved through these deserts. While most kept moving, chasing pasture and shade, the Nabataeans decided to settle near rocky outcrops riddled with natural basins. Historians still argue whether they chose Petra for its trade crossroads or for its unusual water catchment features, but either way they hit the jackpot here. Sandstone acted like a sponge, storing rainwater and releasing it slowly. They carved into this sponge sculpting cisterns that hid their lifeblood underground, invisible to raiders. Step closer to Petra's treasury, that Instagram-famous facade with columns taller than apartment buildings. Beneath its postcard, beauty lies a secret. This showpiece exists only because water allowed people to stay put long enough to quarry, carve, and decorate. Without steady water, no grand stone canvas could have been attempted. Imagine trying to carve Mount Rushmore but having to sprint 10 miles just to fetch a bucket of muddy puddle water first. The city eventually became a caravan hub. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, silks, these goods poured through Petra like files through your downloads folder. But none of it mattered without secure water. Traders wanted safe wells, clean cisterns and fountains where camels could slurp without dying. Nabataeans offered all of that, plus a dazzling stone metropolis as marketing. Forget neon signs, they advertised with monumental facades, screaming, "We are rich, we have water, come trade here." Still, Petra wasn't the only trick up their sleeve. Nabataean settlements stretched across what's now Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Syria, each chosen with the same obsessive eye for water control. Some towns, like Avdat in the Negev, relied on runoff farming terraces guiding rare rains into vineyard plots. Others perched over underground aquifers with elaborate shafts. The web of sites looks random until you realize it's all strung along caravan arteries, each settlement like a gas station where water, not fuel, kept the engine of commerce running. Picture yourself walking into Petra at its peak, say the 1st century CE. The SEQ is buzzing donkeys, braying merchants, hawking cloth incense, curling in the air. Water channels trickle faintly along the walls disguised by plaster to look like natural grooves. At the end, the city opens like a curtain drawn back. Gardens unfurl, shaded by vines nourished by those hidden channels. Children splash in basins. Fountains bubble a luxury in a place where a misplaced sip could mean death on the next caravan leg. The sound of water doesn't just refresh, it reassures, reminding everyone that the Nabataeans had mastered what others feared. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found that some of Petra's pipes were deliberately made with different diameters, almost like a desert-era version of a DJ's volume control. This wasn't sloppy work, it regulated pressure, so water didn't blast through like a broken fire hydrant. The Nabataeans tuned their water flow as carefully as you might tweak your shower temperature. Yet for all their sophistication, Petra was still a fragile miracle. One poorly aimed flood, one season of drought and balance tipped. It's easy to romanticize the rose-red city, but you also have to imagine mud-choked channels cracked, plaster the stink of stagnant cisterns when maintenance slipped. Life here was resilience with a hint of constant panic. As evening deepens, you notice how quiet the cliffs become once merchants settle and animals are tied. You can almost hear the whisper of water trickling in hidden conduits under your feet. That's the heartbeat of Petra, the silent pulse that let this improbable city glow in the desert darkness. You're still drifting through the city's heart, lantern light licking across carved facades, but tonight, the real story runs under your sandals and behind the canyon walls. The Nabataeans didn't just stumble upon water, they mapped it with the precision of a gamer plotting loot spawns on a digital map. Out here, water meant survival, and survival meant noticing every trick the desert tried to hide. Imagine yourself on a scouting walk with them. You leave Petra at dawn, shadows still stretching like sleepy cats. Your guide, a wiry Nabataean with a knack for sniffing out springs, points to what looks like nothing, a patch of greener weeds hugging a crack in the rock. See that, he says, that's a seep, a whisper that groundwater is near. To you it's just weeds, but to him it's like spotting an oasis emoji floating in the sand. The desert teaches patience. They learn to track seasonal flood paths, watching how rainstorms turn dry ravines into roaring rivers for 10 frantic minutes before draining to nothing. Instead of cursing the chaos, they memorize the paths, carving diversions to snatch that water mid-stampede. Historians still argue whether their mapping skills came from centuries of nomadic wandering or whether they inherited techniques from earlier desert cultures like the Edomites. Either way, they refined the art into a Nabataean specialty. By mid-morning, you're sweating like a broken air conditioner, but your guide remains calm, scanning the horizon. He points to a smooth depression in the sand, wide and shallow. It's a catchment zone shaped by nature, but amplified by human hands. When clouds finally crack open weeks later, every droplet here will roll downhill into channels leading to cistern mouths. Think of it like a desert-sized funnel carved not with metal, but with stubbornness and foresight. Here's the quirky part. Some scholars believe they even tracked microclimates, tiny zones where shade or wind made water linger longer. A grove of trees, a bend in a canyon, or even a particular cave might hold cooler air, and with it, longer-lasting moisture. Modern meteorologists sometimes struggle with microclimates, yet the Nabataeans logged them without satellites just by being relentlessly observant. And they didn't hoard the data in dusty archives. Their map was the land itself, etched in terraces, dams, and cistern lids. You could walk a valley and read their hydrological notes. This slope carved means runoff, that plastered wall means storage, that hidden shaft means emergency reserve. Every modification was a footnote in a grand living encyclopedia of water. Of course, desert life always leaves room for debate. Historians still argue whether their mapping of flood channels was primarily for farming or for protecting caravan routes. Did they prioritize grapevines and olive trees or camel caravans and traders' purses? Maybe both. After all, wine and commerce both make a city thrive, just for slightly different reasons. Back in Petra, you'd see the results of this obsessive mapping. A channel carved high in the canyon wall wasn't just randomly placed, it was calculated, so gravity carried water safely into cisterns without turning the street below into a slip and slide of mud. Even the famous theatre, big enough for thousands, had runoff drains tucked neatly under seating to keep the audience from drowning mid-drama. Talk about planning for a rainy performance. Let's sneak in a joke here. Imagine you've paid for front row seats at a Nabataean play, probably something very serious about kings and gods, and suddenly a flash flood barrels in. Without those drains, you'd be less theatre-goer and more soggy laundry. Luckily, their drainage system saved your toga. Another mapping trick involved springs that only appeared seasonally. Nabataeans charted these like clockwork. They knew exactly which gully would cough up a trickle in early spring, which rock pool would last into summer, and which caves trapped dew at night. Some of these water sources were so subtle that later Roman engineers, yes, Romans who prided themselves on aqueducts, failed to relocate them when Petra became part of the empire. That's like someone taking over your house and still not finding the Wi-Fi password. By dusk, when you circle back to the city, you realize how invisible most of this infrastructure is. Tourists today gape at facades, but the Nabataeans must have felt pride in something quieter. The invisible map beneath every stone, the knowledge that floods wouldn't surprise them and caravans wouldn't go thirsty. That hidden map was their insurance policy, their invisible fortress. The desert swallows your footsteps as you pause at a cistern opening carved round and smooth like the lip of a well. Peer down, and you see only darkness. But to the Nabataeans, that darkness was treasure as valuable as any gold stashed in tombs. Their entire civilization rested on knowing where that shadow ended and how much cool water it held. You're back in Petra, lantern in hand, staring at the grooves that climb the canyon walls like veins in stone. The map you traced with your Nabataean guide suddenly connects. It wasn't just about finding water, but moving it, taming it, coaxing it through rock until it bent to human will. That's where the real wizardry begins. Channels, qanats, and cisterns all working together like an ancient desert plumbing system that frankly puts some modern cities to shame. Walk along the Aak again, and you notice the channels aren't rough gouges, they're smoothed, plastered, and sloped at precisely measured gradients. Too steep and the water would roar through like a rogue shopping cart. Too flat, and it would stagnate into mosquito soup. Somehow, with chisels and string lines, they balanced it, letting water flow like a steady heartbeat. Historians still argue whether they borrowed techniques from Persian qanat systems or invented their own versions independently, but either way they perfected the desert's version of hydraulics. The qanats are the most fascinating. Imagine a tunnel dug horizontally into a hillside tracing a natural water table. Above it, a line of vertical shafts punctures the surface, letting workers climb down to dig check flow or haul debris. From above, those shafts look like a dotted line snaking across the desert. From below, it's a cool, damp tunnel carrying water silently toward the city. Think of it like an underground water conveyor belt, except instead of candy bars at a factory, you get survival itself. The cisterns, though, are the crown jewels. You stumble upon one carved deep into sandstone, its walls polished smooth and lined with thick plaster so water wouldn't seep away. The opening is narrow, sometimes capped with stone, to keep evaporation and thirsty bandits at bay. Step close and you feel a cool draft like the desert itself is exhaling. It's eerie standing on the lip of so much hidden wealth invisible until you peer down. Some cisterns held thousands of cubic meters, enough to keep caravans watered, households supplied, and gardens blooming. Quirky detail. Some cisterns had carved steps spiraling down the inside so you could walk into the water chamber as the level dropped. Imagine the chore. Honey, can you fetch water? And suddenly you're descending 50 damp, echoing steps with a jug, hoping you don't slip and end up a permanent cistern ghost. Practical, yes, but also a little spooky. The Nabataeans even experimented with pressure pipes. Archaeologists have found ceramic pipelines where narrowing diameters created higher pressure, allowing fountains to spurt upwards in courtyards. Yes, fountains in the desert. Nothing screamed wealth and control more loudly than wasting water in a splashy display just because you could. Historians still debate whether these fountains were purely decorative or had ritual significance, but either way they were flexing hard. As you wander deeper into Petra, you realize the whole city was choreographed by water. Streets followed drainage lines, courtyards had basins, rooftops collected rainfall and funneled it into jars below. Every drop was accounted for, tracked, stored and guided. If you've ever tried to manage roommates and a shared fridge, you know the chaos of unplanned consumption. Now imagine that with thousands of thirsty people and camels, and you'll appreciate the Nabataeans' micromanagement. And yet, There's a whisper of fragility here. Channels clogged with silt if neglected, plaster peeled in heat and had to be replaced. A cistern wall could crack in an earthquake, bleeding out the city's lifeline. One bad season, and this careful symphony faltered. The desert patient and merciless always waited to reclaim what humans borrowed. Still, the sheer cleverness deserves awe. Picture a rainstorm pounding the cliffs, water cascades mud, churns, torrents rage. But instead of disaster, the system hums. Channels grab the flow dams, calm its cisterns, gulp it down. Hours later, streets are dry, and Petra carries on as though nothing happened. That's engineering as invisible magic, the kind you don't notice until it fails. Here's a light joke for you. Imagine a Nabataean teenager sneaking out at night, parents yelling, "Don't forget to refill the cistern on your way back." That's desert grounding for you, no water, no freedom. By the time you settle on a rock ledge, moonlight painting the canyon silver, you realize the Nabataeans weren't just building storage, they were building trust. Every traveler who arrived saw a city where water was controlled, dependable, and abundant. That confidence turned Petra from a dusty canyon into a thriving hub, the rose-red city half as old as time and twice as clever in its plumbing. The desert is quiet, the stars sharp as pinpricks overhead, but your ears are tuned now not to silence, but to the faint scrape of chisels that once rang through these cliffs. You imagine the Nabataean work crews, shadows against torchlight hacking tunnels into sandstone. No magic portal delivered water here. It was sweat muscle and stone dust. If you lean against the canyon wall long enough, you can almost hear the rhythm of picks striking rock like an ancient percussion band hammering out survival. Sandstone, luckily, isn't the worst rock to carve. It yields under pressure, crumbles when struck, and even softens when heated. The Nabataeans took advantage of that. Controlled fire, essentially bonfires lit, against rock faces would expand the stone, and sudden dousing with cold water cracked it, loosening chunks for chiseling. It's the prehistoric equivalent of thermal shock, like when you pour boiling tea into a glass mug and regret it instantly. The Nabataeans just weaponized the concept. Pick and drill techniques also mattered. Archaeologists have found traces of holes drilled systematically, then split open with wedges. Imagine crouching in a dim, echoing shaft, tapping wedges into place while grit falls into your hair. Teamwork was essential. Crews rotated shifts, passing down baskets of rubble, hauling up fresh air with leather bellows when tunnels grew stuffy. Historians still argue whether they organized these crews by family clans or specialized guilds, but either way the work required discipline. One mistake, one unsupported ceiling, and your project became a tomb. Now let's sprinkle in a quirky tidbit. Some tunnels have notches carved into the walls at intervals like ladder rungs. Were they used to climb in and out, to wedge beams for scaffolding, or maybe as a primitive form of timekeeping, marking how far a day's work had progressed? Archaeologists debate their purpose, but whatever the answer, they're like fingerprints left by hands, long gone. And oh, the tools, bronze chisels, iron picks, hammers, smoothed from years of striking. The sound must have been deafening inside enclosed shafts, amplified by stone. Imagine the gossip swirling in there. In Roman bathhouses, barbers doubled as gossip specialists. Here, miners probably swapped news while hauling rubble. Did you hear someone's goat drank from the sacred cistern again? Desert drama carved into stone. Of course, no work site is complete without hazards. Picture a tunnel collapsing, dust choking the airmen scrambling toward faint light at the shaft mouth. Or worse, striking a pocket of water unexpectedly, a sudden gush flooding the gallery, washing tools and workers alike. Historians still argue whether some odd tunnel terminations represent abandoned projects or catastrophic breaches. The sandstone keeps its secrets close. Yet somehow, with all these risks, the Nabataeans produced miles of tunnels that still function today. Gravity was their constant ally. Each tunnel sloped imperceptibly, just enough to let water flow. Too much tilt and erosion chewed the channel apart. Too little and water pooled, stagnated, and grew algae thick enough to host the desert's first accidental aquariums. Their geometry was simple, yet astonishingly precise: string lines, plumb bobs, and sheer intuition guiding every cut. Here's your light joke for this stretch. Imagine a Nabataean engineer boasting at dinner, "I can carve a tunnel straight enough that water never stalls." And his cousin replies, "Big deal, I can pour wine straight without spilling." Both in the desert were talents worth celebrating. Timber played a role too. Temporary shoring beams hauled from scarce forests miles away held ceilings while men worked. Every log was precious. Once the section was secure, beams were often removed and reused in the next gallery, leaving only faint impressions in the stone. So even where you don't see wood, you can almost sense the ghost of a tree that once stood on a far-off hillside, sacrificed to feed Petra's thirst. By dusk, torches would flicker out crews, stumbling back into the open air, coughing dust faces smeared with grit. They'd walk into the city knowing that today's progress, maybe a few more meters of tunnel, a fresh cistern lined, meant survival when the skies next opened. Their work wasn't glamorous, but without it, the treasury, the amphitheater, the gardens, all the wow factor stuff would never have existed. You sit on a ledge brushing stone dust off your hands and realize the paradox. The beauty of Petra is carved from leisure and artistry, but that leisure was bought by men underground, sweating in tunnels that most visitors never see. The silent secrets are theirs. Chiseled in the dark, their hammer beats long faded, but still echoing in the city's survival. Your sandals crunch on grit as you duck into one of those narrow, echoing tunnels. The air cools instantly, swallowing the desert heat. But what strikes you isn't just the damp smell of carved sandstone, it's the way sound behaves in here. Every drip of water, every shuffle of your feet ricochets like a pebble dropped in a cave of mirrors. And this is where the Nabataeans may have had another trick up their sleeve, using acoustics as both tool and language. Imagine a team chiseling away in the dark, no Bluetooth headsets, no radios, just echoes. When they struck the wall, the sound told them if it was solid or hollow, if their tunnel was veering off course, or if they were about to break into a cistern. In a way, they listened to the rock, the way a doctor taps your chest and listens for hollowness. Quirky as it sounds, some archaeologists argue that the echoing acoustics helped them align different tunneling crews, working from opposite ends. Too sharp a clang and you knew you were still far, a soft boom and you were nearly through. There's another fringe theory, though historians still argue, whether it's fanciful that some tunnels were designed to sing. The airflow through narrow shafts and angled cuts creates tones like a flute hidden in the rock. You walk a little further, pause, and sure enough, a faint hum like wind turned into music. Was it an accident of engineering, or a deliberate choice to give the underground world a voice? Hard to say, but once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. The Nabataeans may even have used Nox taps or rhythmic strikes as a form of code between work crews. Think of it as the desert's Morse code tap-tap, pause tap. A message echoing through sandstone corridors telling workers when to stop or how close they were to water. Of course we can't prove this, but when you hear your own footsteps multiply into a chorus around you, it's not hard to imagine. And yes, you'd better believe kids probably snuck in here and scared each other silly with echoes. Boo ricocheting down 100 meters of stone could make even the bravest Nabataeans sprint out shrieking. Some jokes never age, but acoustics weren't just for workers. Water itself became music. Picture a cistern filling during a sudden rainstorm. Water pouring down channels, splashing into a chamber, creating a thunderous roar underground, while the city above went about its business. To the Nabataeans, that sound wasn't noise, it was reassurance, proof that their system worked, that their lifeblood was being banked in stone coffers. Here's a quirky tidbit. Modern visitors have reported strange resonances in certain Petra chambers, where even a whisper carries unnaturally far. Some suggest this was exploited for rituals, priests speaking softly, their voices magnified to sound otherworldly. It wouldn't be the first time a civilization blended practical engineering with theatrical effect. After all, if you can make water flow uphill with pressure pipes, why not also make your gods' voices echo through stone? Still debates rage. Was it intentional design or just happy accident? Historians still argue whether acoustics played a central role in construction or whether we moderns are simply over-romanticizing. Either way, the effect is undeniable when you stand in a tunnel and clap your own sound races away and returns like a ghost applauding back. Now for a lighter thought, imagine being a Nabataean teenager late for curfew. You sneak through a tunnel shortcut only to hear your own footfalls chasing you like a phantom. Every drip sounds like a pursuer. Suddenly you're sprinting, promising never to break curfew again. Acoustics, nature's built-in parenting tool. By the time you emerge back into starlight, the hush of the desert feels oddly flat. No echoes, no whispers of stone, just the open sky, vast and unamplified. You realize that the Nabataeans didn't only engineer water, they engineered soundscapes. Their tunnels weren't silent after all. They carried voices, signals, and reassurance, leaving behind a hidden symphony in the rock, waiting centuries for you to walk in and listen. You step back into the city as dawn spills pale light over sandstone walls, and suddenly the water you've been chasing through tunnels and echoes reveals its softer side. It isn't just survival here, it's comfort, routine, even pleasure. You pass through a narrow lane into a courtyard, and the first thing you notice isn't the carved pillars or the shadows, but the gentle trickle of water collected in a shallow basin. Someone has left pottery jars nearby, clay, cool to the touch. The desert's harshness fades, replaced by the hum of daily life shaped entirely by liquid silver. Picture a Nabataean household at breakfast, bread-baking children darting about the courtyard fountain bubbling faintly in the center. Water carried by gravity-fed channels arrives like an invisible guest, present, dependable, and absolutely necessary. It isn't wasted, every drop cycles. Once the basin overflows, it trickles toward the garden patch out back where figs and pomegranates strain against the desert's odds. It's not lush like the Nile Delta, but it's enough to remind you that green things can exist in red stone. Step next into a public bathhouse. Yes, Petra had them, smaller than Roman thermae, but clearly inspired by Mediterranean culture. Steam hovers in dim rooms, oil lamps glow, and water heated in clay furnaces warms the air. Imagine sliding into a stone tub after a day in desert dust, hearing voices bounce gently off the walls. Historians still argue whether these bathhouses were everyday amenities or reserved for elites, but either way they prove that water here wasn't just rationed, it was celebrated. And let's not forget pottery. The Nabataeans were skilled potters, their kilns burning bright on the city's edges. Jars, amphorae, and bottles weren't just vessels, they were lifelines carrying water for caravans stretching across blistering miles. One quirky detail, their pottery was so thin-walled it almost seems impossible. Archaeologists have held pieces up to light and seen it glow like eggshell. Lightweight for travelers, yes, but also fragile. You'd better have packed a spare jug if you were headed toward the next oasis. Here's a lighter thought for you. Imagine being the Nabataean teenager, tasked with carrying amphorae of water for a caravan, only to trip over a rock and shatter 3 at once. That's not just grounded for the weekend trouble, that's no water for Uncle's camel's trouble. Bet that teen wished Wi-Fi had been invented so they could Google how to glue pottery fast. Back in the city, water choreographs daily rhythms. Market vendors sprinkle it over vegetables to keep them fresh in the sun. Gardeners irrigate terrace plots with trickling channels, each carefully opened and closed with simple stone plugs. Women scrub clothes in basins, their chatter blending with splashes. In temples, priests pour libations, the trickle mingling with incense smoke. It's everywhere, woven into life so tightly that you almost forget how impossible this scene would be without those tunnels you just crawled through. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found small niches carved into cistern walls, perhaps for oil lamps. Imagine trudging down 50 damp steps in the dark just to fetch water. Of course you'd want a light. But some argue these niches may also have held offerings, tokens to thank the water gods for not abandoning them. Daily life and devotion side by side in stone alcoves. By mid-afternoon, when the desert sun scorches, Petra cools itself with fountains. Yes, fountains in the desert. Some were modest, others dramatic, but all sent a clear message. We're not just surviving, we're thriving. The Romans may have perfected the art of ostentatious aqueducts, but the Nabataeans quietly matched them, hiding pipes in cliff walls and producing sudden bursts of water in courtyards. Historians still debate whether these fountains were primarily decorative or functional cooling systems, but either way, they dazzled. Here's another joke to lighten the heat. If you wanted to show off to your Nabataean neighbors, you didn't buy a flashy sports car, you installed a courtyard fountain. Bonus points if it splashed dramatically when your friends walked by. As night folds in again, the sound of water becomes softer, almost lullaby-like. Courtyards echo with trickles, jars fill drop by drop, and Petra breathes easier. You realize water isn't just infrastructure here, it's the rhythm of life setting the tempo for meals, rituals, rest, and dreams. The desert remains just outside the walls, waiting with its thirst, but inside the city, water makes life not only possible, but beautiful. The morning comes with a hush, the desert sky washed pale, and for once your attention isn't on channels or cisterns, but on the way people kneel at springs. You've followed the Nabataeans long enough to know water was survival, but here it is, also spirit. You step quietly into a small hollow beside a cliff, and the first thing you notice is not architecture, but devotion. A trickle from the rock, carefully caught in a carved basin surrounded by offerings. Coins, beads, little clay figurines. The Nabataeans didn't just drink from these places, they believed the springs themselves were alive gifts from gods who listened. Imagine standing at one of Petra's sacred fountains, the air scented faintly with incense. A priest lowers a vessel, lifts it high, and lets water pour in a deliberate stream. The trickle isn't just practical, it's ritual. The Nabataeans left offerings at many such sites, tokens of gratitude or pleas for protection. Historians still argue whether their water cults were linked more to local deities or influenced by contact with Greco-Roman gods like Aphrodite or Dionysus, but either way, the sacred shimmer of water is unmistakable. And then there are the fountains, yes, those extravagant desert fountains you chuckled about earlier. In courtyards and temples, spouts of water did more than cool the air. They became theatrical. Imagine sunlight catching droplets, turning them into glittering beads as music played in the background. It wasn't just look, we're rich, it was look, the gods favor us. They let us waste the desert's most precious gift in beauty. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists have uncovered carved water channels that lead directly into temple courtyards, sometimes ending in basins shaped like lotus flowers or animal heads. Decorative and symbolic. Was the water thought to cleanse worshippers, to bless them, or simply to awe them? Nobody knows for sure. But it suggests that religion here wasn't only about statues and prayers, it flowed quite literally through the city. Of course, devotion and practicality tangled often. A cistern could be both pantry and altar. Imagine descending those spiral steps by lamplight, balancing your jug and pausing before a niche with an oil lamp flickering. Do you mutter a quick prayer? Do you leave a pebble or bead in thanks? The lines between daily habit and sacred act blurred constantly. Historians still argue whether Nabataean religion was monotheistic, polytheistic, or somewhere in between. Some inscriptions point to a chief deity, Dushara, lord of the mountain, often linked with fertility and protection. Others show devotion to Al-Uzza, a goddess associated with springs and lushness. You can almost see why, when you live in a place where water itself feels miraculous. The divine surely dwells where water dwells. Here's your light joke for this stretch. Imagine being a Nabataean child sneaking sips from a sacred basin, only for your mum to hiss, "Don't drink from there, that's for the gods." Talk about an awkward family dinner later. So did the gods enjoy your backwash? Ritual purity mattered. Before entering certain shrines, worshippers likely rinsed hands or feet. Pilgrims traveling along caravan routes would pause at springs not only to water camels, but to wash themselves spiritually. Water's double life as cleanser of bodies and cleanser of souls made it irreplaceable. To spill it recklessly wasn't just wasteful, it bordered on sacrilege. Quirky fringe. Note some fringe theories even suggest certain Petra temples were built to harness seasonal water flows, timed so that once a year water illuminated or flooded an altar. It's speculative, but the alignment of channels and thresholds has sparked debates among archaeologists for decades. Maybe it was coincidence? Or maybe the Nabataeans choreographed worship with the same care they choreographed hydrology. By twilight, as shadows stretch long, you imagine the city quieting. Households murmur around fountains, priests close, shrines, basins glint faintly in the fading light. Water is no longer rushing or trickling, it's resting like a deity settling into slumber. You realize that for the Nabataeans, water wasn't just liquid, it was presence blessing mystery. To live with it daily was to live with gods in your courtyard. You wake into another day in Petra, but this time the mood feels heavier. Not because the sky is less blue or the cliffs less pink, but because you begin to notice that every trickle, every jug, every channel is quietly tied to power. Water here isn't just sacred, it's currency. Whoever controls the cisterns controls the people. Imagine you're a caravan leader trudging up the Wadi Musa with your camels groaning under bundles of frankincense. You've been marching for weeks, and the moment Petra's sandstone cliffs open before you, your first thought is not, wow, nice architecture. It's, where can I get my herd watered? The Nabataeans knew this. They offered refreshment, but at a price. Pay the toll, barter some spices, or leave behind silver, and the gates of water open. Refuse, and your camels cough dust, while your goods spoil under the sun. Water as leverage, sharp as any blade. One mainstream fact: Nabataean rulers imposed trade taxes and fees that made Petra rich. Caravan after caravan passed through on the incense route, carrying goods from Arabia to the Mediterranean. But the toll wasn't always coins. It could be measured in access to springs rights to refill, or even contracts to escort travelers to the next reliable well. Petra's prosperity wasn't only sandstone, it was water receipts. Here's a quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found evidence of marker stones along caravan paths, some etched with signs that likely indicated where water was stored or who had the right to draw from a cistern. Imagine an ancient road sign that reads, "Next water, 2 days." Bring exact change. It's like Yelp reviews for oases, except no stars, just survival. Historians still argue whether Nabataean control over water was centralized, one king holding monopoly, or distributed through clans and merchant families. Either way, their society revolved around negotiating who drank first, how much, and at what price. The desert was their vault, and water was the gold locked inside. You picture a bustling Petra market. Camels kneel, baskets unload, traders haggle. Somewhere nearby, officials sit with scrolls tallying debts and duties. Not a drop of water flows through the system without someone keeping account. It's bureaucracy by bucket. The very tunnels you crept through earlier weren't just lifelines, they were ledgers in stone. And of course, political power flowed right alongside. A ruler who could promise reliable water during drought would hold loyalty. A rival clan who suddenly diverted a channel might spark unrest. Water treaties existed long before ink dried on parchment. They were cut straight into sandstone. Your light joke for this stretch: imagine Nabataean teenagers complaining about chores. "Ugh, Dad, why do I have to carry water to the tax collector? Can't we just Venmo them already?" Ancient banking, but with amphora. Caravan leaders sometimes bartered not only goods but information. Knowing where a hidden cistern lay could make the difference between profit and ruin. Secrets of water became like intellectual property, and the Nabataeans guarded those secrets fiercely. Some cisterns were concealed, others camouflaged under sand until the right moment. Outsiders never knew all the keys. But controlling water also meant diplomacy. The Nabataeans weren't just desert warlords squeezing caravans dry. They had to balance relationships with neighboring tribes, empires, and eventually Rome. Offering water at strategic times kept alliances smooth. Denying it could spark raids. In a sense, Petra's cisterns were its embassy's stone vessels where politics pooled. Historians still argue whether the city's sudden wealth from incense trade would have been possible without this water monopoly. Was Petra destined for greatness because of location alone, or did its tunnels and dams actively create the trade empire? The truth, like a hidden cistern, lies somewhere beneath layers of dust. By evening, you find yourself perched on a sandstone ledge, watching shadows deepen across the valley. Below, you imagine the city glowing with torchlight cisterns, locked gates, barred water carefully guarded until dawn. Somewhere, a merchant counts coins, a priest blesses a spring, and a guard checks the locks on a stone channel, and you realize this entire empire is less about kings and armies and more about who holds the key to the tap. Night settles in Petra, and though you expect stillness, what creeps into your thoughts is secrecy. The more you wander among the Nabataean tunnels, the more you realize not all of them were meant to be seen. Some lie buried beneath sand, others sealed with carved stone, as though deliberately hidden. Water was survival, yes, but sometimes it was also a weapon, or at least a safeguard. Imagine walking along a channel and suddenly finding a shaft that plunges into darkness narrow enough to squeeze through, yet clearly man-made. You drop a pebble and hear it splash somewhere far below. Not a public fountain, not a household cistern. This is something else, concealed, strategic. One mainstream historical fact: archaeologists have uncovered entire sections of Petra's hydraulic system that bypassed the main city, funneling water toward high plateaus or secret reservoirs. Some scholars argue these were emergency supplies locked away in case of siege. A city that depends on water flowing in open channels is vulnerable, but a city with hidden caches beneath the rock, that city can outlast an enemy. A quirky tidbit for you: some tunnels are cut so smoothly and disguised so well that modern explorers first mistook them for natural fissures. Only after careful surveying did they realize the walls bore pick marks, the roof a slight arch. The Nabataeans had engineered camouflaged plumbing. Imagine burglars hiding their safe behind a painting. Only here the safe was a cistern, and the painting was an entire cliff face. Historians still argue whether these hidden conduits were purely defensive, or whether they also served ritual and political functions. Were secret springs reserved for elites a kind of liquid privilege, or were they simply a smart backup plan in a desert prone to betrayal by climate? Either way, secrecy gave the Nabataeans resilience. You picture the city under threat. Raiders camp in the distance, hoping thirst will drive Petra to surrender. But while outsiders watch the main channels, Petra's people slip into tunnels under cover of night, drawing from reserves the enemy doesn't know exist. To outsiders, the city should have withered, yet it persists as if protected by invisible hands. That illusion alone could have been worth more than any wall. Your light joke for this section: imagine being a Nabataean teenager sent to fetch water from one of these secret cisterns. You wander into the wrong shaft, get lost in pitch dark, and finally pop back up in somebody's courtyard mid-dinner. Oh hey, sorry, just taking the long way to the well. The neighbors must have loved that. And secrecy wasn't just for enemies. Trade competitors, neighboring tribes, even visiting diplomats, nobody got the full blueprint. The Nabataeans controlled information as tightly as they controlled water. Outsiders could marvel at fountains and baths, but they'd never see the underground arteries that really kept Petra alive. Think about it: when Rome eventually annexed Nabataea in the early 2nd century CE, they inherited wealth and trade routes, yes, but they also inherited this labyrinth of hidden hydraulics. Did they fully grasp the system, or did some tunnels remain known only to locals, slowly fading into myth as centuries passed? Historians still argue whether Roman engineers improved the system or merely maintained what was already genius. Standing at the mouth of one such passage, you feel a chill. Not just from the cool breath of underground air, but from the realization that these silent channels carry more than water. They carry secrets, strategies, and survival plans carved directly into the bones of the desert. They are Petra's invisible fortresses, unseen walls stronger than stone. The desert sun climbs high again, casting Petra's cliffs into gold and rose, and you begin to see that water wasn't only about survival, faith, or power, it was also spectacle. The Nabataeans were not content to simply drink, they wanted to dazzle. Water became theatre. Picture yourself entering the heart of Petra along the Sik, that narrow, winding canyon. The walls tower above you, shadows stretch long, and suddenly you hear it, the faint, deliberate trickle of water running beside the path. Channels are carved right into the canyon walls, carrying streams toward the city. Travelers dusty from weeks in the desert would have stepped into Petra, already impressed not just by cliffs carved into temples, but by the very sound of water escorting them inside. Mainstream fact: the Nabataeans engineered terraced gardens within the city. Archaeologists have uncovered irrigation systems that once supported lush green patches. vines, palms, perhaps even exotic imports. Imagine walking through a city of stone and then stumbling into a courtyard cooled by shade and plants fed by cleverly hidden pipes. The Nabataeans didn't just live, they curated an oasis. A quirky tidbit, some fountains and basins were shaped like animals, lions, camels, even birds. Open-mouthed spouts would gush water as though the creatures themselves drank from the desert and shared it with humans. It was practical plumbing with a wink of artistry. Imagine kids daring each other to stick their heads under a lion's spout while adults tried to keep straight faces. Historians still argue whether Petra's grandest water displays were purely decorative or politically symbolic. A gushing fountain in the middle of a desert city shouted a message louder than any speech: we command the impossible. In a way, fountains were propaganda. You didn't just see power, you heard it splash, felt it cool your skin. Now imagine evening when lamps flickered around these courtyards, droplets caught in the glow shimmering like jewels. Music played, dancers spun, merchants toasted with wine diluted by the very water channeled through hidden tunnels. To drink was to participate in the miracle. To bathe was to acknowledge Nabataean mastery over nature. Your light joke for this section: if you were a Nabataean party planner, the biggest flex wasn't fireworks or catering. It was making sure your fountain didn't sputter mid-banquet. Nothing kills the vibe faster than a lion-headed spout coughing out air bubbles. And the shows weren't only for locals. Caravans brought guests from Egypt, Mesopotamia, even Rome. Traders returned home telling stories not just of Petra's wealth, but of its fountains, gardens, and bathhouses, liquid luxuries that clung to memory long after spices and incense were sold. The city marketed itself through spectacle, its reputation traveling faster than camels. Quirky archaeological note: traces of plaster and pigments have been found on some water basins, suggesting they were once painted. Imagine fountains painted in vivid blues and reds, water gliding over surfaces bright as mosaics. The desert may look monochrome now, but Petra was never beige, it shimmered. By night's end, as torches die down and fountains trickle softer, you realize water wasn't only for thirst or crops. It was art, it was drama. It was the city performing itself into memory. Even centuries later, standing in the ruins, you still hear the applause, written in stone, echoed in every channel that once made the desert bloom. Another day begins, and you find yourself wandering the edges of Petra, where the city blurs into the desert. Here the question shifts from how the Nabataeans used water inside their walls to how they managed it across the wider landscape. It wasn't just an urban trick, they choreographed an entire region. Imagine standing on a high plateau and looking down at a wadi, the kind of dry riverbed that only carries water a few days a year after violent desert rains. To most travelers, wadis meant danger, flash floods roaring without warning, sweeping away caravans. But to the Nabataeans, wadis were opportunity. They built dams across them, slowing floods, redirecting torrents into reservoirs. Nature's chaos became storage. Mainstream fact archaeologists have documented at least 8 major dams around Petra, some reinforced with ashlar masonry, others carved directly into rock faces. These weren't small walls, they were massive constructions designed to protect the city and trap precious runoff. When the desert raged, the Nabataeans harnessed it. Quirky tidbit: one dam, called the Sikh Dam, was constructed to divert floods away from the very canyon tourists walk through today. Without it, the Sikh would have been scoured clean every rainy season. Imagine if the Nabataeans hadn't built it, there might be no treasury facade left at all, just rubble washed into the valley. Their engineering literally preserved their wonder for us to gawk at centuries later. Historians still argue whether these dams were mainly defensive, protecting Petra itself, or whether they were part of a broader agricultural strategy. Evidence of terraced farming suggests both. Water caught in dams was guided to fields where barley, wheat, and vines could grow, supplementing trade with homegrown food. Petra wasn't just a caravan stop, it was an agricultural hub, carved out of stone and floodwater. You picture farmers trudging up terraces with baskets of figs, shouting greetings across stone channels. Children chase each other along irrigation ditches. Camels graze on patches of green, where runoff pools briefly. All this in a land outsiders swore was barren. Your light joke here: imagine being a Nabataean farmer who oversleeps during the rainy season. You wake up, sprint to the terrace and realize your neighbor already opened the channel and grabbed the lion's share of runoff. Sorry, guess you should have set a sundial alarm. The Nabataeans extended their water control far beyond the city. Caravan routes bristled with cisterns dug into remote cliffs, some so well hidden they were only rediscovered in the 20th century. Travelers following their paths were essentially moving from one engineered oasis to the next. Each stop was carefully spaced a day's journey apart, like beads on a necklace of survival. Quirky note graffiti carved by ancient travelers has been found near some cisterns. Names, prayers, little sketches. You can almost imagine a weary merchant scratching, "Thanks for the water, Petra PS camels approve." These cisterns weren't just infrastructure, they were lifelines acknowledged by generations of passing strangers. By twilight, standing again in the heart of the city, you realize Petra was more than a metropolis. It was a web of controls stretched across desert miles, every dam, terrace and cistern feeding the center. Water wasn't just within the walls, it radiated outward, binding landscapes together. In truth, Petra wasn't an isolated miracle, it was the visible heart of a vast hydraulic organism. The night deepens, and as you drift further into Petra's story, you begin to notice how water shaped not only survival and spectacle but also identity. To be Nabataean was in many ways to be someone who understood water, its moods, its tricks, its secrets. Their culture itself was carved by liquid. Imagine a child growing up here. From the time they could walk, they'd watch adults lift heavy jars, clean out channels, seal cistern lids with plaster. Water wasn't abstract, it was play, chore and lesson all at once. A child's lullabies might be sung over trickling fountains, their games played around basins, their coming of age marked by trips into tunnels to fetch the family's share. Mainstream fact: Nabataean inscriptions often reference water in prayers and dedications. Springs were linked with goddesses of fertility, and abundant cisterns, sometimes marked with protective symbols. To them, water wasn't just resource, it was language, a vocabulary they lived inside every day. Here's a quirky tidbit: fragments of pottery, inscribed with graffiti, have been found, some joking, some solemn. One sherd scholars think may have been a merchant's doodle about his cistern rights. Imagine ancient sarcasm. This jar belongs to me, and so does the water hands-off, proof that even in antiquity, paperwork and property disputes crept into daily life. Historians still argue whether the Nabataeans thought of themselves as desert nomads who became city builders, or city builders who clung to nomad memory. Water ties both identities together. Nomads remembered wells and hidden springs. City folk turned those memories into stone channels and reservoirs. In both cases, knowing where water was and keeping that knowledge guarded was what made someone Nabataean. You picture evening festivals where water itself played a role. Maybe pitchers of it were poured out ceremonially, or fountains decorated with flowers. Stories might be told about ancestors who first discovered springs, about gods who blessed the desert with rain. In a land so dry, even a sprinkle from the sky could feel like a festival gift. Your light joke here: imagine being the unlucky Nabataean who sneezed during such a festival, spraying everyone nearby. Someone probably shouted, "See, even he's imitating the fountains," and that poor soul was remembered forever as the sneezer of Petra. Another layer of identity: water distinguished Petra from its neighbors. Other tribes lived harshly, scraping by on seasonal rain or moving constantly in search of wells. But Petra stood still and thrived. Its people could point to their fountains and say, "We are not just wanderers, we are masters of water, we belong here." It was a cultural anchor, a badge of pride. Quirky archaeological note: in tomb paintings and carvings, vessels for water appear alongside jewelry and weapons. To be remembered properly, a person needed not only adornments or tools of power, but also a symbol of water. It was legacy itself. By the time night covers Petra, you feel the quiet pulse of identity everywhere, in the worn steps, down to cisterns, in the faint grooves of channels still etched into canyon walls. The Nabataeans may be long gone, but their sense of self, lingers in every drop of water they coaxed from the desert. Their identity, like their tunnels, still runs beneath the surface, hidden but unbroken. The dawn creeps back, and this time the story you follow feels less triumphant. Petra's fountains once sparkled, its cisterns brimmed its gardens, glowed green against the red desert. But no empire, no matter how clever, holds water forever. Slowly, you begin to trace the story of decline, how the same system that made Petra great could not shield it from time. Imagine drought stretching longer than expected. The dams catch less runoff, the cisterns fill only halfway. A city that relies on its hidden reservoirs suddenly finds them too shallow. Families ration drops, fountains sputter, caravans whisper that Petra is losing its magic. Water, once abundant, now betrays. Mainstream fact by the late 1st century CE, Nabataean power was fading even before Rome formally annexed the kingdom in 106 CE. Trade routes, shifted sea lanes became safer and cheaper than overland caravans. Without endless caravans to tax, Petra's economy weakened. And when wealth dries up, so does the ability to maintain sprawling waterworks. Cracked plaster, clogged channels, neglected cisterns, systems crumble quickly in desert heat. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found abandoned channels filled with silt, their plaster flaking like sunburnt skin. Some cisterns appear to have been patched hastily, as though repairs were desperate last minute. Imagine the frustration of a Petra mason muttering, "Another leak." Again, only to know the treasury no longer had funds for proper work. Historians still argue whether water shortages were a decisive factor in Petra's decline, or simply a symptom of larger political and economic shifts. Some say earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries CE destroyed key dams and aqueducts, crippling the city's infrastructure. Others argue Petra was already fading by then, its glory eroded by neglect. Perhaps both are true. The city was weakened, and when disaster struck, it could not recover. You picture Petra in these later centuries: fountains, dry gardens wilt, households line up at remaining wells. The proud showmanship of water becomes memory, a story told by elders. Outsiders who once marveled now shake their heads. The miracle is gone, and slowly caravans choose other routes. Temples gather dust, and silence seeps into the city. Your light joke for this section: imagine being the last Nabataean in charge of fountain maintenance. Every day, someone asks, "When's it going to flow again?" And you just shrug and say, "Soon. We're waiting on rain back order." Worst job in the ancient world. Even after Rome annexed Petra, the city did not vanish overnight. Romans respected its grandeur, even built new structures. But Petra was no longer the beating heart of desert trade. Without wealth to draw and water to maintain spectacle, it became provincial, then peripheral, then nearly forgotten. By nightfall, you sit at the foot of the treasury staring at its silent facade. Once water ran here, echoing in channels, sparkling in basins. Now only wind whistles. The decline wasn't sudden, it was a slow unspooling of water from stone until all that remained was silence. And you realize even the greatest masters of water cannot stop time's thirst. You rise again into Petra's ruins, but this time you're no longer walking among bustling Nabataean families or watching fountains dance. You're in the long, quiet centuries after the city's decline, when water no longer sang in channels but whispered faintly beneath the dust. What remained of Petra was less empire and more echo. Imagine Byzantine monks settling among the cliffs in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. The city's trade glory has faded, but its cisterns still hold enough to sustain small communities. Monks carve crosses into walls, adapt tombs into chapels, and collect rainwater, just as the Nabataeans once did. To them, Petra is no longer a capital, it is a refuge, a desert monastery where water nurtures prayer rather than empire. Mainstream fact: archaeologists have found evidence of Byzantine churches in Petra, some built right atop Nabataean structures. The great waterworks still functioned, at least in part. Channels were patched, cisterns reused. Even in decline, Petra's genius endured enough to anchor centuries of quiet habitation. A quirky tidbit: travelers in the Islamic Golden Age described Petra in passing, often noting its carved facades, but rarely its people. By then, locals used the ancient channels and cisterns in simple, practical ways, watering goats, collecting runoff. Imagine shepherds leading flocks through the sick, stopping to let animals drink from basins that once impressed kings. To them, this was no wonder of the world. It was just Tuesday. Historians still argue how continuously Petra was inhabited. Some believe small communities persisted here for centuries. Others think it was largely abandoned, visited only by Bedouins and passing caravans. What's clear is that Petra never fully vanished. Its water system, even in fragments, allowed life to cling stubbornly to stone. You picture centuries of dust blowing through the empty streets of cisterns, filling with silt of rains, carving new paths through old dams. Occasionally travelers stumble upon it, Arabs, crusaders, merchants, but few stay. Petra becomes legend whispered in distant lands as a city of ghosts carved from rock. Your light joke here: imagine a Byzantine monk or later Bedouin stumbling across one of Petra's enormous dry fountains. So, this is supposed to work. Guess they lost the instruction manual. Even ancient marvels look confusing when they stop functioning. And then in 1812, the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt arrives, disguised as an Arab pilgrim. He persuades local guides to lead him to the ruins. What he sees stuns him: temples, tombs, facades, but also the ghostly remains of water channels running through the cliffs. His reports ignite Western fascination. Suddenly Petra is reborn in the imagination of the world, less as a living city than as a rediscovered miracle. Quirky note: when early European travelers sketched Petra, they often ignored or misunderstood its water systems, focusing on the facades instead. Only later did archaeologists realize the true secret was not the carved temples, but the silent tunnels beneath. Petra dazzled eyes, but it survived by plumbing. As night deepens in your story, you sit with this realization: Petra never truly disappeared. Its waterworks kept it alive in whispers, sustaining monks, shepherds, explorers, and finally, archaeologists. Even when fountains ceased, the memory of water lingered in stone grooves, waiting for someone to notice again. The final dawn spills over Petra, and you find yourself standing in the silence of ruins that are anything but dead. The city may no longer ring with children's laughter at fountains or merchants shouting over water rights, but the tunnels and cisterns remain carved into the bones of the desert. They are Petra's true monuments, more enduring than facades, more vital than temples. Imagine crouching once more at the mouth of a water tunnel. Sand fills parts of it, bats flutter in the shadows, yet the pick marks on stone walls remain sharp. You reach out, touch them, and it feels as though the workers who carved here have only just left for lunch. Even after 2,000 years, their fingerprints linger in grooves of sandstone. Mainstream fact: modern archaeologists and hydrologists study these channels intensely, mapping how the Nabataeans harnessed every drop. Some experiments even attempt to reactivate small sections, proving the systems could still work today if properly maintained. The desert remembers, and so do the stones. Quirky tidbit: in 2000, researchers used satellite imaging to trace ancient Nabataean water networks across the broader region. Some hidden cisterns were so well camouflaged that even high-tech eyes struggled to find them. The Nabataeans weren't just engineers, they were illusionists, making water appear and disappear at will. Historians still argue about the balance between Petra's visible beauty and its invisible infrastructure. The treasury and monastery draw tourists, but scholars insist that the true wonder lies underground. A carved facade is art, but a tunnel that keeps a city alive for centuries, that's civilization. Now you picture modern Bedouin families living among the ruins, some still using cisterns, others guiding visitors through the Siku. To them, water remains central. Bottled or piped, it follows the same old truth: without it, no one belongs here. The legacy of Petra isn't just tourism, it's the unbroken lesson that desert life means respecting water. As more than utility, it is identity, ritual, and power. Your light joke to close: imagine a Nabataean engineer time-traveling to today, seeing tourists snapping selfies at the treasury. He'd probably mutter, "Forget the facade, look at the drainage system behind you. That's the real miracle." But of course, nobody ever Instagrams a gutter. And so the story winds to rest. You've walked through Petra's bustling markets and hushed shrines, descended into hidden cisterns, marveled at fountains, and witnessed decline. You've seen water as survival's spectacle, weapon, and prayer. More than anything, you've seen how silence itself holds memory, how stone tunnels keep whispering even when the city above falls still. As night finally folds over the valley, you let the echoes settle. The trickle of unseen water becomes a lullaby, a reminder that the Nabataeans once coaxed rivers out of rock and left them humming in the dark. The desert sleeps, the tunnels breathe, and you close your eyes, carried on the silent secrets of Petra's water.